Okay. Good morning, everybody. So, what we're going to do this morning is we're going to talk briefly about the War of 1812. Now, if you think about the essay question that I'm asking y'all for this unit, is which force was stronger, nationalism or was it sectionalism? And what we're going to look at this morning is definitely a probably one of the largest example of nationalism in my opinion, that you're going to have in the 1800s, at least the early 1800s. Okay, so the War of 1812 is very very interesting. Y'all recall last time in class we saw that our old ally, the French, were really upset that we were not helping them in a war that they had triggered against the British, and as a result, they had started a quasi war. And President Adams had responded by sending the U.S. Navy out to deal with French shipping. And our six warships, the six original frigates, did a spectacular job dealing with the French. And part of the reasons they were doing so well was because of the British, our old enemy during the American Revolution, was actually helping us. They were actually, in some cases, arming some of our ships. Another component of that quasi war was privateering, where U.S. ships, privately owned, were given letters of marque by the government, and they were allowed to go out and attack French shipping, almost like legalized piracy. And again, the British were helping that. They were at war with the French. The French were attacking us. We were defending ourselves, and the British looked at this as the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they were actually helping us and aiding us, especially the private ships, the privateers, who were conducting legalized piracy. And this was something that was a big time turnaround. So our relationship with the British also was a positive in that they were our largest trading partner. Even after the American Revolution, we were sending resources to them. They were sending finished goods to us, and so that part of the triangular trade was still in place. Okay, here's something in the background. It's my coffee pot. So we were still trading. We were still part of that triangular trade network, and so the United States and the British, even after the American Revolution, was tied together quite nicely. And so, what happens in 1812 is really interesting. Um, it looks like for a while we and the Brits are going to kind of become closer and closer, and it looks like our old ally, the French, we were going to become further and further away. And then the British do something that um, is just something this tragic for all sides. Britain and France had been at war with each other since the French Revolution of the 1790s, and now it is the early 1800s. And by the early 1800s, the French Revolution had turned full circle. The French had gotten rid of their king, and now they had allowed someone named Napoleon Bonaparte to become the new emperor. So they got rid of the king. They fought among themselves, going full circle, and then they ended up with an emperor. So their revolution goes full circle. And now Napoleon had built this mighty, mighty French army that had defeated Austria, had defeated Prussia, it had invaded Spain, was basically rampaging across Europe. And the only thing protecting Great Britain was the English Channel and the power of the Royal Navy, the British Navy. The problem with this is that each one of these Royal Navy ships needs manpower, a lot of manpower, hundreds and hundreds of sailors. And life on board a British warship, for lack of a better word, really stinks and sucks. It's not good. discipline is unbelievably harsh. The word you can use is draconian. It's not something that most people would say, yeah, I would like to be in the British Navy. Being a British sailor was unbelievably hard. And, although some people did volunteer for this, the British oftentimes had to resort to simply drafting people. And your term of service was long. It was, and oftentimes, you would stay on one of these sailing ships for years without, you know, much, port time or being able to leave. It was harsh, but the Royal Navy was considered the best in the world, and um, the sailors were trained to a level where they were unbelievably good at what they did. But if you were a British sailor, you kind of didn't want to be there a lot of times. It was just a harsh occupation. All right. And the British needed men, they needed ships, they needed the Navy to protect themselves from Napoleon and this massive French army. And the only thing protecting or keeping Napoleon from coming across the English Channel would be the Royal Navy. Um, Early in the 1800s, the Royal Navy had defeated the French Navy, supported by the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar. And so this just reinforced the point that the Royal Navy was the only thing saving Great Britain from the French coming across and conquering it, like Napoleon had conquered most of Europe. And we'll see this phenomenon again in World War II, but a side point. So back to manpower. Manpower was so critical for the Brits that they had a tendency to stop American shipping. An American ship flying an American flag would be stopped by a British warship, and British Marines would board that ship, and they would line the crew up, and they would, in some cases, have each crew member say a few words. And if they detected an English accent, they would simply grab that person off the ship and place them into the Royal Navy, and they would declare that person a deserter from the Royal Navy, meaning someone who had left the Royal Navy without permission. And so, since our Navy was very small, there was no way that we could protect all of our ships crossing the Atlantic. All right. Now, um, France and Britain being at war with each other, if you could make a cargo ship run from, say, Boston to Marseille, France, or Boston to London, if you could get products into Britain or into France, the payday was enormous. Um, both countries needed American resources. And so a lot of sailors were willing to take the risk of being snatched off the ship for the enormous payday that they could possibly get for making these runs across the Atlantic. And so this was a risk that many American sailors were definitely willing to take. Again, money is a big motivator. And so this unusual situation of American ships going across the Atlantic Ocean and then being stopped, excuse me, my long mouth, being stopped by the British Navy and then having members of the crew pull off. Um, it's kind of against the amount of monetary rewards you would get for going over, was kind of going on in the early 1800s. Now, President Jefferson um, follows John Adams, and President Jefferson has a very interesting way of dealing with this. All right. What President Jefferson is going to do is simply to prevent American sailors from being taken off of our ships. He's simply going to cause the U.S. merchant ships not leave port. He's going to have a law passed in Congress called the Embargo Act. And because the British and the French are not being nice to us, he's simply going to not sell resources to them. And he's thinking like the American Revolution. The way we hurt the British during that time period was by boycotting their products. So when the Sugar Act came into effect, we just simply didn't eat sugar, and it hurt the British economy. When the Stamp Act came into effect, we simply refused to use the stamps. And when the Townsend Acts were used as a form of taxation, all the different little products that were bought, we simply didn't use them. And so Jefferson, thinking back to that time period, now President of the United States, said, okay, we're just going to simply not send resources to Europe, hurting their economies and therefore making them play nice. Again, law is called the Embargo Act. This is a very stupid way of dealing with the Europeans. They need resources. They'll find those resources from some place on the planet. Why not? Why not us sell them those resources? And mainly the sailors that are manning these ships are from New England, and the New Englanders are very willing to take the risk of being snatched off of American warships. I mean, excuse me, American merchant ships by British warships. It's like, you know, there's a job that you're offered and it has an enormous amount of risk to it, and you take it simply because you're willing to take the risk. It's as simple as that. The Embargo Act absolutely destroys the economy of New England. New England is totally dependent on shipping and trade. Remember back in the 13 colonies when we talked about how that section of the United States had very little farmland that was really, really good to use. You could do some farming, but not much. And so they had to turn to other economic activities. And one of the things New Englanders were known for was shipping. They would move products across the Atlantic. And now President Jefferson, has had a law passed through Congress saying that no products could leave American ports to prevent American sailors from being snatched off the ships. But the American sailors are mainly from New England, and they are more than willing to take the risk because of the payday. France and Britain are at war with each other. They need products. They'll pay whatever to get those American products. So, you know, let's jump on ships and send them. And if one of us gets stolen, well, that's on us. If one of us gets kidnapped and put in the Royal Navy, that's on us. We'll take that risk. And President Jefferson said, no, we're going to keep all the ships in port. We're going to totally embargo. Well, you know, this law starts to just be ignored. New Englanders begin to really just say, the heck with it, we're just going to ignore this law. And they are continually leaving port bound for Europe. And they're just basically saying, the heck with you, President Jefferson. So President Jefferson comes up and says, okay, you British and you French need our products. The one of you that will be the nicest to us, we will sell our products only to you. And immediately Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, raises his hand and says, yes, we will be the nicest to you. And so Jefferson, again, in my opinion, in a very stupid move, says, okay, all of our products will now just go to France. He likes France anyway over Britain, so why not help them? And so now, if you're the British, this looks like you are now taking sides in these Napoleonic Wars, and now the stopping of American ships gets ramped up even more, and more American sailors are taking off ships. And it looks like what President Jefferson has done is absolutely backfired. And the good thing about all of this for President Jefferson is that he leaves office. He serves 2 terms, he leaves, and then leaves it to the next president, James Madison, you know, little itty bitty Madison, 5 foot of him, with Dolly as his wife, walks into the White House, and it becomes his mess to clean up. And the attacks on American ships or the stoppage of American ships is increasing, and it climaxes with the Royal Navy attacking one of our warships. The USS Chesapeake was coming in from an anti piracy patrol in the Mediterranean trying to stop um, North African pirates from attacking U.S. ships, and it had been cruising in the Atlantic in the Mediterranean for a few months. And it was coming back to Norfolk, and it had its guns stored and all the ammunition put away because it was 2 days away from port. And a British warship, Her Majesty's ship HMS Leopard, comes up next to the Chesapeake and demands it stop. And at that point, American sailors are trying to get the guns run out. They're trying to get the battle stations, but the ammunition has been stored. And at that point, the Leopard fires on the USS Chesapeake. And because um, it was ready to go into port, it wasn't ready to fight this British warship. And this is a massive insult to Americans. This incident, the Chesapeake incident, really drives most Americans into the camp of we need to fight the British now. All right, so President Madison has done had enough of this. Okay, and then this stealing, and the word for this is called impressment. The impressment of American sailors is really making a lot of people in the United States ready to go after the British one more time. Then it comes to light that the British have been arming Native Americans from Canada to attack new American settlements in the West. Native Americans would go up to Canada, get weapons, come back. And the idea behind this is that they would then be able to stop American settlers from going west. And Madison he's done. Impressment on top of the fact that the British are arming Native Americans, we're done. And a group of congressmen, members of Congress, led by a man named Henry Clay and then John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, are beginning to be referred to as war hawks. They want Britain to stop, and they think the only way to make the British stop is through war. President Jefferson then asked Congress for a declaration of war. We declare war on Great Britain. Now, think about that for a second. The British do not declare war on us, we declare war on them. You know, you barely survived the American Revolution with the help of France. Now you're picking a fight with the global superpower of the 1800s. And you expect for this to work. It's tough. Also, the United States is very divided in this conflict too. The New England states, their main trading partner, where most of their products go, is still to Britain. Even though you've had this stupid law passed by Jefferson saying that France is going to be nice to us, therefore we were going to sell products to France, the New Englanders are still doing business with the Brits. They pay more. The New England sailors are willing to take the risk, and so New England votes against this war. All of New England, with the exception of a few places in Maine, that's right next to Canada, which is still British possession, they vote against going to war with Great Britain. Now, if you're going to go into a conflict, one of the things that you have to ensure is unity and that everybody's on the same page, or else it's not going to work. And that was one of the reasons for the Alien and Sedition Act that President Adams had Congress pass. Was that in case we go to war with France, we're going to be united. It was misguided, but the thought process is good. So now we go into the War of 1812 completely disunited. New England is against it, whereas most of the middle Atlantic states, New York to Pennsylvania, and all of the South are supportive of it. And the war begins. And we begin by taking the US Army and invading Canada. The idea behind this is that Canada is a British colony, like the 13 colonies were. And if we invade Canada, the Canadians would rise up and fight against Great Britain. And it would simply be a matter of marching into Canada, and then Canada would possibly become part of the United States. Also, large numbers of Canadians are leftover settlers who are descendants of France, leftover Frenchmen, and they don't like the British. And so the thought process is at least those people would rise up and fight against the British once we enter Canada, and then help throw Canada over to our side, and possibly parts of Canada or all of Canada would become parts of the United States. And the US military is thoroughly defeated. We march into Canada and we are just pummeled. We're not ready. We're not experienced. We're not well trained. US military is not in a good shape. And part of that is because of Jefferson's fear of a large military. He had cut military spending in the years that he was president. And so our military capacity was not good. And so by marching into Canada, we expose how weak we actually are. And smaller numbers of British soldiers backed up by Canadian militia, meaning their National Guard, end up just defeating the US military at every single point. And this invasion of Canada is just an absolute debacle. And, good word to use, debacle, mean disaster. And the US is thrown back across the border with the Canadians and British in pursuit in many cases. The city of Detroit is captured and occupied by British forces, and this is not good. At the same time, Native Americans throughout the West see this as an opportunity, and in the South, a Native American nation called the Creeks have part of their people rise up against the United States, seeing this as an opportunity to grab more, to push white settlers further out of their territory. And the US military now has a massive Indian war that they're having to deal with. Again, not good. All right. So, like the Quasi War, the US Navy is sent out to try to do something. And to be honest with you, US Navy does well. Again, it does well. It is able to do some of the same things to the British that we did to the French in the Quasi War: fly false flags, hit and run. And a legend is actually born during this time period. One of these ships, USS Constitution, is seen in a fight with a British warship, and it seems like the cannonballs are simply bouncing off Constitution sides. And so the crew nicknamed her Old Ironsides. And she, as well as these other ships, have been built in such a way where you have oak planks, sandwiched against more oak planks in a way that reinforces the wood. And so therefore, because of the way they were built, it's very difficult for cannonballs that time period to penetrate. And a legend's born, and she's still with us. I mean, the USS Constitution is the oldest U.S. warship. It was one of the original 6 frigates built after the American Revolution. It fought in the Quasi War. It fought in the War of 1812, and it is still technically a part of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy maintains it, and you can visit it today in Boston Harbor. I challenge you right now to take a look at it as I'm talking. Look up the USS Constitution. It's a beautiful, beautiful little ship, and she is actually seaworthy. The U.S. Navy takes her around Boston Harbor once a year, on their own power, on their own sails, and it's a well-preserved ship. So I digress. Now, so the war is going good at sea, bad on land, and the British decide to teach us a lesson, and they land forces in Maryland. So this is now a full British invasion of the United States, and the idea is to march on Washington, D.C. And there's an attempt by the U.S. military to block the British invasion, and it goes badly. And the British march into Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. Now, Dolly Madison's in the White House, and she is told that the British are marching down Pennsylvania Avenue en route to the White House. U.S. military has not been able to hold them, and she has British or U.S. Marines grab a portrait of George Washington that's hanging in the White House and is saved. And then as portrait of Washington and these group of U.S. Marines are leaving the White House, the British are coming up the road, Pennsylvania Avenue, and then they enter the White House and they burn it. And they burn the U.S. Capitol building as well. And the U.S. Capitol is completely destroyed. Next, the same British force then starts to move on Baltimore, Maryland. Now, the idea is the British Army will come up to Baltimore from the land, and the Royal Navy will attack Baltimore from the ocean. And there's a small little fort that the British Navy hasn't yet passed. It's called Fort McHenry. And so what ends up happening is interesting. The U.S. military grows a backbone. And as the British military is moving up towards Maryland, there's a series of hit and run attacks with the U.S. military. And the U.S. military starts doing what it does best in the early 1800s. It's not a necessarily stand up and fight type force, but the U.S. military is basically just picking off the British, and they end up killing the general in charge of this invasion force, which then paralyzes the British military as they move towards Maryland. At the same time, British warships start sailing up towards Maryland and to try to get into Baltimore Harbor. And Fort McHenry starts getting shot at and shelled by British warships. He wants to destroy the fort so that the warships can sail past it. And y'all, the U.S. military in Fort McHenry just operates spectacularly. And they're able to repel this British attack. And in the morning, the British have been unable to get past this fort. No matter how hard they shoot at it, the U.S. soldiers inside this fort resist and resist and resist and resist. And in the morning, as the sun pops up, a gigantic American flag is hauled up the flagpole of Fort McHenry. And the British basically turn around, leave because they cannot silence this fort. And the British military coming into Baltimore from the land side has been defeated. And so it's like it's the first time that the U.S. military has been able to stop the British. It's a big deal. Now, a lawyer named Francis Scott Key is actually on a British warship. He's a Baltimore lawyer. He's trying to get one of his friends out of jail or out of custody of the British. And he witnesses the morning after this all night fight to silence this American fort. And what he sees is big American flag go up, and he writes the Star Spangled Banner. And it's meant to be a poem. Eventually, it will be set to music, and it becomes our national anthem. Now, interesting point: the music was not initially written for the poem of the Star Spangled Banner. It comes from a British drinking song. So we are the only nation who has a national anthem set to a drinking song. Look it up and then read the words. It's quite interesting. More on that later. All right. Then the war seems to turn around for us. Now, the Creek Indians who rise up and try to push out white settlers are defeated by a young, energetic general named Andrew Jackson. Then Andrew Jackson and a force of Tennessee militia, National Guardsmen, are sent down to New Orleans because there's a belief that the British are going to try to seize New Orleans and take as much of the Mississippi River as possible, which is exactly what they're going to do. And the British try again to attack the United States at the port of New Orleans, which we have recently acquired from France. More on that in the follow-up work on this video. And the British land a very large force at the mouth of the Mississippi River. They're going to march on New Orleans, capture it, and take as much of the Mississippi River as possible. Andrew Jackson and a group of Tennesseans, General Andrew Jackson, is put in charge of the defense of New Orleans, and he makes a call for, quote, anyone who wants to kill the British to show up. And now, if you've ever seen that History Channel show Swamp People, the Swamp People show up. And it's all these former French settlers from every swamp and holler and, throughout southern Louisiana shows up. And you've got these Tennessee militia guys. You've got the small knot of U.S. Army troops, not very many, only a few hundred. And then you have the citizens in New Orleans with weapons. And it is probably the motliest group of U.S. soldiers ever put together. You have Choctaw Indians fighting on the side of Andrew Jackson to defend New Orleans. And it is absolutely a cross section of America. And then the problem with Jackson is he doesn't have enough ammunition. And then in comes a pirate named John Lafitte. And he brings in enough ammunition to supply the U.S. Army. This is a guy who is a full-blown criminal, a pirate, and he asked for one thing: I will give you and supply you with as much ammunition as you need. We have it stockpiled. I simply want amnesty and U.S. citizenship for my men. And Lafitte was not someone who had a pirate ship. He was somebody that had a handful of pirate ships. And so when Jackson says, fine, I will write you amnesty, I'll make sure President Madison backs me up on this. You have all these pirates now becoming part of this U.S. Army as this group of hardened criminals. And the British attack New Orleans, and they are just defeated. It is the worst defeat of a British army until World War II. The British march up the bank of the Mississippi River, beating drums, waving flags, and the Americans just lay into them. We are hiding behind trenches and giant sacks of rice and anything, and cotton bales and whatever else we can throw across this open area of land. And the British try to march straight up into it and are just destroyed. And a second British general goes down, and the British have to withdraw. And the Battle of New Orleans is a resounding American success and a humiliating British defeat. Okay, that is the War of 1812. I don't know if you can call it a win. Representatives from Great Britain and representatives from the United States meet at Ghent, Belgium, to work out an agreement to end this. And the agreement is very simple. We're just going to stop fighting. We're going to go back to the way things were before the war. We, as the British, will not steal your men off your ships. Well, guess what? Napoleon is kind of defeated, so he's on the way out. And so there's no need to do that anymore, but the British relent. And they say, okay, we won't take your men. And the Americans just say, okay, we'll go back to doing what we're doing and trade with y'all. And so it's a war, this in many cases senseless. But what it does is it creates an enormous amounts of pride in being an American. We have just, quote, defeated the British for the second time. It really wasn't us defeating the British. We survived a beat down by the British for the second time. But the view among many Americans is that there's enormous amounts of pride. The Star Spangled Banner comes out of it. The legend of Old Ironsides USS Constitution comes out of it. And it's just an unbelievable boost in American pride. And New England initially does not support this war. And even in New England, there's pride because nobody wants to back a loser and everybody wants to back a winner. And we are winners, 100%. At least that's the way it's viewed. And one more thing about this, a man named Andrew Jackson comes out of this conflict as a household name. And that's important because he's going to ride this fame of being a war hero all the way to the White House. Okay. So definitely nationalism with the War of 1812. Okay, guys, thank y'all. And I will have some follow up questions. So, anyway, appreciate you listening, and y'all have a good rest of your week.